We're going to be starting on this sheet called logical down at the bottom. Now, I guess the first thing that we want to do is just make sure that we have a little bit of a refresher. We want to define define some terms again quickly, so that way we can make sure that everybody's on the same page and everybody remembers what's going on, since it's been a week since the last session, and there is some terminology that I want to make sure everybody remembers. So the first bit of terminology is a range of cells. A range of cells is going to be a group of cells that are located physically together in sort of a rectangle or a line on your sheet. So for example, this particular range of cells is E3 to G7. This range is E3 to E3 to E8, and this range is E2 to I2. The way you write that in terms of a formula, if I were referring to a specific range in a formula, I would type it as, say, for instance, L5 to, let's see, O13. So I've got L5, a colon, and then O13. It's a colon, not a semicolon. So just be wary, be aware of that. But you should get it color coded when you're typing it into a formula. Speaking of which, let's quickly review the definition of a formula. A formula basically is just it's sort of a set of instructions telling Excel how to calculate something. Whoops, see, lost my window there for a sec. Hang on. Okay, cool. So it's sort of a set of instructions that tell Excel to calculate a specific thing that you want it to figure out. So, for example, if you have some figures in your sheet that you want to and you want to get a total, then you can use the sum function in a formula to add that all together, or you can just use a plus sign like we talked about last week. And that brings us, of course, to functions. Functions are the building blocks of formulas, and they're sort of tricks that Excel already knows how to do. For example, the average function allows us to quickly calculate an average by just pointing Excel to a group of numbers that we wanted to average. So, so to use that in a formula, you would type the word average, the keyword or the name of the function. You would open a set of parentheses. So you hold shift while pressing 9. And then down here at the bottom, it prompts us, okay, this is what we need for this type of function. We would put the numbers in. And then after the numbers were in there, we would close it up with a right parenthesis. So shift and then 0. And then, by the way, 8.3 repeating is the average of 5, 7, and 13. Anyway, so that's a function. A function is the building blocks of a formula, and we're going to be dealing with a few pretty useful functions during this session. The last one to talk about is the, okay, well, I have the wrong workbook open. Hang on just a sec. Let me pull up the right one for, well, while I'm doing that, we'll talk about the last thing. So the last bit of review terminology that I want to make sure we're everybody's aware of is a, there we go. Okay, good. The last bit of review terminology I want to make sure everybody's aware of is a sheet. A sheet in Excel terminology is actually a spreadsheet. Again, an Excel file an Excel file as a whole is known as a workbook rather than a spreadsheet because it can contain multiple sheets or spreadsheets. And so, so that's important important to remember just because of, when you're looking something up, you want to make sure that about Excel, you want to make sure oh, this is what I'm what I'm looking for. So for our example file today, we have a bunch of different sheets included. There's a sheet called logical, members, data validation, duplicates, protecting, conditional formatting 1, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If there are more sheets than can show up on your screen, like it is with mine right now, I can use these little arrow buttons right here to scroll back and forth and see more sheets. And I can also click this plus sign down at the bottom to add a new sheet if I want to. All right, so those are our little review bits. Let's go ahead and dive in. So last week we talked about a few different types of formulas that are pretty common and useful, basic math formulas and formulas dealing with dates and times. This one is slightly different. Let's take a look at this first example here on the logical sheet. Now, if you're not on that sheet, again, just click logical over here on the left. If you're too far over and you can't see it, click this little arrow until you see it, and then click logical to switch to it. Okay, cool. So we've got our sheet open here. And what I'm doing is basically keeping track of a little contest between Jack and Diane. They're scoring all these points, and we want Excel to show us who the winner is. That's pretty easy to do with the type of setup or the type of formula that we're going to talk about now. What we're going to do is talk about what are called logical functions. So in the formulas that we've talked about so far, the functions that we use have been pretty straightforward. Basically, in every case, you take some pieces of things and you kind of put them together or deal with them in some way, and then it comes out. There's really only one sort of possible outcome. Adding these logical functions, what it does is allow us to take account for different types of scenarios, a lot of different types of scenarios that and deal with things differently depending on the situation. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to click in the in this cell here, C15, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to come up here to the top and click in the formula bar. When I click in the formula bar, or the reason I'm doing that, again, as I mentioned last week, that's not strictly required, but clicking in the formula bar makes it easier to correct mistakes when you inevitably make them in typing, as we all do. So I'll click in this cell, C15, and then I'll hit the equal sign to tell Excel to expect a formula, because of course, as we've talked about, every formula in Excel starts with an equal sign. Then I'm going to type the word if, just like that. And then I'll open a set of parentheses. So if is a new function, like the other functions that we discussed last week. And if calls for 3 different pieces of information in order to work, or as we referred to them last week, arguments. There are 3 arguments that we're being prompted for here underneath. Logical test, value if true, and value if false. So first up is the logical test. With the logical test, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see which of these is the higher amount. So let's say B13 is greater than C13. All right, so B13 and then a greater than sign. A greater than sign is the one, shares a key with the period on your keyboard. So you'll hold shift while pressing the period key, and that'll give you the greater than sign. So B13 is greater than C13. You'll see, whoops, 14, excuse me. These are the mistakes I was talking about. So I'm going to change that to B14 and C14. Those are our totals. So they're color coded for me so I can tell which ones I'm pointing to in my formula and make sure that it's correct. And the color coding helped me out there. Okay, so that's our logical test. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to give Excel a statement. So we're going to say Excel, or, we're essentially giving it something to check. Is this true or is this false? So that's our first argument, the logical test. So I'm going to put C14 is greater than C14 and put a comma after that. The next argument that we're being prompted for, which technically is optional, but we're going to use both of these arguments every time, is the value if true. So the value if true is going to be basically, so if B14 is greater than C14, then something's going to happen. And so we're giving it a value, or we're giving it something else to calculate. Basically, we're going to be saying, okay, if it's true, do this. If it's Y, do that. So if it's true, our value of true is going to be the name Jack in quotation marks. There we go. Okay, so I have B14 is greater than C14, comma, and then in quotation marks, the word Jack. What that's going to do is basically just display the word Jack in this cell, almost as though I had typed it in there manually, but I won't have to because the formula is going to do it for me. So our value of true, if B14, the cell here with Jack's total, is greater than C14, the cell here with Diane's total, then we know that Jack has won the contest, and in the winner cell right here, it'll show Jack's name. So far, so good. Next thing that I'm going to do is outside of those quotation marks, I'm going to put a comma, and then I'm going to put in quotation marks again, Diane. There we go. So these are our three arguments. B14 is greater than C14 as our logical test. If it turns out that that's true, then it'll say Jack's name down here at the bottom. Then, and then our third argument after the comma is Diane right here. So if it turns out that this is false, the value of false, Diane will be declared the winner in our cell C15 here. All right, so now that that's done, I'm going to close my parentheses, press enter on my keyboard, or click the little check mark here, it doesn't matter. And there we have it. Diane is the winner because she had 675 points versus Jack's mere 634. So that's looking good so far. And that's what a logical function can do. Basically, it says, check this, see whether it's true or false. If it's true, do one thing. If it's false, do another thing. And the thing could actually be several steps in each case. In this case, though, this formula is slightly broken. If you look at it, you'll notice that, well, actually, let me just show you what I mean. So if I go down here and I change 675, you'll notice Diane is still being declared the winner here. The formula is actually working the way that we wrote it. So technically, in a sense, everything's fine. But obviously, this is not the desired behavior that we want. The reason that this is happening is it is still not true that B14 is greater than C14. And so Excel looks at this and it says, okay, it's false. B14 is greater than C14. So it uses the value of false, which is Diane's name. So the formula is working as we wrote it, but it's probably not working as we really want it to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an additional step to this. I'm going to leave all this as it is, but then I'm going to come over here and I'll put a few spaces here just to keep things separate so that you can see what I'm doing more easily. I put a few spaces in between the equal sign and the word if. And now next to the equal sign, I'm going to put another if right here. So I'll type if again, open a set of parentheses, and then we'll add a different logical test. B14 equal sign C14, or B14 is equal to C14. I'll put a comma. So that's our logical test. That's our first argument. Our second argument is going to be the value of true. So if they're equal, then we have a tie. So I'm going to put tie in quotation marks there. And then I'll put a comma outside the quotation marks. Excuse me, that was our second argument for this leftmost if function. And then our value if false is actually just going to be all of this right here. So I'm going to erase all this and leave everything else as it is. The only thing that I have to do in addition to this is close off this initial if function over on the left. So I'm going to put a right parenthesis here at the end of the line. So I should have two right parentheses, one red and one black. Again, just a reminder from last week, if you have a set of parentheses that's inside another set of parentheses, then the inner parentheses will be red and the outer parentheses will be black. They're color coded together so that way you can see which left parenthesis goes with which right parenthesis, which is really useful. Okay, so now we've got our new version of the formula. When I hit the check mark here, you'll notice now it's being declared as a tie. If I change this to 630, then we see Diane's the winner. If I change this to say 600, then Jack's the winner. So our formula is working correctly. One key thing, particularly as you develop more complicated formulas, as you as you work on this, one key thing to remember is you always want to test your formulas. So if I just written the first formula and looked at the result and said, oh, okay, well, yep, Diane is the winner, and it says Diane's the winner, so formula is working, that can be fine. And and of course, I kind of skipped over when I'm talking to you about a second ago. It can be fine to do that. Or it could be fine to do that. But for a formula like this, like if I hadn't really thought about it, then I would have ended up with a bad answer, or I could have potentially ended up with a bad answer or an incorrect result here in the cell just because I wasn't paying attention. So what I want to do is kind of like, if I didn't already know that old version of the formula wouldn't work the way I wanted it and this version would, then I would go in and I'd probably test this cell with these cells with different values and just see like, okay, in this situation, does it give me the right answer? In this situation, does it give me the right answer? There are basically only three results that you could have for a contest like this. Either one person's a winner, the other person's the winner, or there's a tie. But I would want to, because those are the three possible outcomes, I would want to try the formula with all three scenarios to see whether it worked or not. And if it didn't, then I'd need to look at my formula more closely and try rewriting it. All right. So let me show you one other really useful thing to do with the logical functions like this. And then we'll move on to a different topic. So I have on this sheet essentially I have the members of a club listed out here on this members sheet. So if you're following along, you can click members down at the bottom. I've got full names and full addresses right here. And then I have the individual information kind of broken up a little bit more. So Mr. Pryor Myatt here, but then over here in column C through E, I have Mr. and Pryor and Myatt. So what I want to do with this, and so what's happening here over in cell A2, I have this function called concatenate. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's not very interesting, honestly, but it is useful sometimes. The concatenate function, or in newer versions of Excel, I think maybe 2016 and onward, it's just called concat without the innate. But concatenate is your fancy $5 computer word for today. And all it means is taking some text and putting it next to some other text. That's all it is. And that's exactly what the concatenate function does. For this particular formula, we do actually have 5 arguments for the concatenate function, but they're pretty simple. So the first argument is C2. That's the cell that has the title in it, in this case, Mr. Then I have a comma to separate that argument from the next one. The next argument is just a period and a space. So rather than MR space prior Myatt, I have MR period space prior Myatt. So we have period space inside of quotation marks. And again, that's just kind of it's what we call a string of text. It's basically just a little bit of text that's inside of quotation marks so that it's treated as text rather than anything else. After those quotation marks, I have another comma and then D2. D2 is where the first name is. The next argument after that comma is just a space inside of two quotation marks. So that way I'll get a space between the first name and the last name. And then finally, E2, which has the last name. So put that all together, you have Mr. and then period space, prior, and then space, and then Myatt, like that. So that's all this formula is doing right here. What I want to do now, though, is look a little further down because there's a problem. You'll notice down here, starting on row 9, I get a stray period in each of the column A cells, and I get a stray semicolon and a comma in each of these column B cells. We're not going to deal with the column B cells, but that's there for you to practice later on if you want to. You can essentially you can do the same thing that we're about to do in column A over here. The reason for this, of course, is that the formula is still here. So on row 9, I still have a formula that uses C9, D9, and E9, but those cells don't have anything in them, and so on all the way down a good ways. So what I want to do, circling back to where we were ultimately going, what I want to do is use the if function again, this time to kind of clean this up and make my sheet look the way I want it to, even when there's no data for the formula to work with. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to start with in cell A2. And then I'm going to come up to the top in the formula bar here. I'm going to click in between the equal sign and the word concatenate. And I'll put a few spaces, again, just to kind of visually separate, because I'm going to leave all this intact. I'm just going to wrap it in an if function like I did a moment ago. So I'm going to use the word if. I'm going to open a set of parentheses right here. And then first we're being prompted for our logical test. What we're going to do here is we're just going to check to see whether these cells are blank. But in order to do that, because I need to check multiple cells, I'm going to use a new function, the OR function, just the word OR. And I'll open another set of parentheses to go with that function. So inside the OR function, we have multiple logical tests as indicated down here, logical 1, logical 2, ... So the first one I'm going to do is C2 equal sign, and then 2 quotation marks with nothing in between. So you'll hold shift and press the comma key, and that gives you quotation marks. So we have 2 quotation marks with nothing in between. And what that's saying, 2 quotation marks with nothing in between in an Excel formula means a blank cell, nothing, what we call a null value in computer world. And so, so when I put C2 equals quotation mark, what that means is C2 is a blank cell. So we'll check to see if it's a blank cell. Then we'll also check D2 equals quotation mark, and I'll put another comma there, E2 equals quotation mark. Okay, so far so good. So we've got all of that in there. These are our 3 cells that we want to check. I'm going to close my parentheses for the OR function, and all of that is my logical test, this OR function right here. So I'm going to put a comma outside of the parentheses. And now we're being prompted for our value if true. So if it's true that C2, D2, and E2 are blank, then obviously we don't want the rest of this really to do anything. We want this to look like a blank cell if the columns over here are blank. So what I'm going to do is just put quotation mark, one more time. So value of true is a blank, nothing. I'll put a comma. And now our value of false is concatenate C2 and all that stuff like we talked about earlier. Now, the only thing I have to do, because again, every time you have a left parenthesis, you got to have a right one to go along with it. All I've got to do is add that right parenthesis. So I'll go click here at the end of the formula, hold shift, hit 0, and there it is. Now I'll hit the check mark or press enter. And you'll notice this hasn't changed. So that's a good thing. I edited cell A2, the formula in cell A2, so that I could copy it down on all these other rows. But obviously, if there's information over here, I do want it to show up over here in column A. To quickly copy this down, I'm going to use the flash fill that we talked about last week. So once I've confirmed, once I've locked in this formula, I'm going to have the cell selected. I'm going to come over here and find the little dot in the corner, move over it so that my mouse turns into a black plus sign, and then double click on the dot. And that will fill all the way down until there's nothing next to it, essentially. So all the way down to here, row 202 or 201, I guess. So that way, any of these 200 rows where I fill in a name, once I've got a title, a first name, and a last name, then it'll fill in. Now, if I don't have all three, the title, the first name, and the last name, it won't work because I've used the OR function. Getting it to work if there's anything in here, but you don't have all three filled in, is a little more challenging. So we're not necessarily going to dig into that. There is a way to do it, but it's just a little different. So and we've got plenty of other topics to cover. So if you want to find out more about that, here's what I recommend. Click on the Formulas tab up at the top, and then click on Logical in this function library area. If you do, you can see all of the different logical functions like if and or, but there's also an and, there's if error, if in a, there's true and false, there's XOR. All of these you can use in similar ways to the if and the or. Yeah, I highly encourage you to look into these. They're extremely useful. And of course, with any of these, if you want to know more about them, you just move your mouse over it and click on this Tell Me More. And it's going to take you to documentation from Microsoft that tells you exactly what that function is and gives you examples. It's really very useful. And the thing about this is part of the reason this function library exists is it's really super hard to remember all of these functions. So they don't expect you to. No one expects you to. Anyone who remembers all these functions, I would venture a guess, has too much time on their hands. So, so if you're like, I know there's a function that does this, just come over here to the Formulas tab, look in this function library, and you'll find it. Even those of us who use Excel extensively, we don't remember all the functions because, you know, we need brain space for other things. Okay, cool. So any questions about logical functions before we move on to another topic? Excellent. Okay, cool. Well, if you think of something a little later on, let me know. We'll circle back. No big deal. Okay, so let's move on to data validation. I'm going to click on the data validation sheet down here at the bottom, and that takes me to this little thing right here. So in this particular example, I'm dealing with sort of customer service cases of various sorts. I have the names of the customers, I have the account number, I have a column for the customer type, I have a case number here, a category, a status, case, the date the case was opened, how many days it's been open, calculated by the net work days function that we talked about last week, and a priority level so that I know which cases are the highest priority and which cases are a little less important. So some of this stuff we're going to use later on, but what I want to do right now is I want to set up my, I want to set this up so that in these columns where it says customer type, category, and status, I can keep them consistent. Because let's take the customer type, for example, that's here on the left. Over here on the right, I have it listed out. My 3 customer types are business, consumer, and government. So I could, each time I add a case to my sheet to keep track of it, I could just type, this one's a consumer. So I could just type consumer like that, press enter, and then move on. And down here, this one's a government, but that's a pain. And honestly, what can happen sometimes is when you're trying to fill in information like this, rather than typing it out, and a lot of times, if you're in a hurry or, you're just a little tired or whatever, you might not fill in, you might not type that information correctly. So I might come down here and type Cosmer or whatever. If I do that, then if I try to sort these out or put them into a pivot table like we're going to talk about next week, or put it on a chart of some sort, then if I put it in a pie chart to see what proportion of each customer type, what proportion of my workload is each customer type, then I'll have like one slice of the pie chart that says consumer, and then I'll have a tiny slice of the pie chart that says Cosmer, and that won't work too well. So what I want to do is I want to try and keep this, whoops, put that in the wrong column. What I want to do is I want to keep this information consistent from row to row. And I might also, and I'll be showing you some other things that I can do with this as well that are quite handy. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a feature called data validation to make this work correctly, basically to ensure that I have the correct information in each cell in this column. So here we go. First things first, I'm gonna just clear this out. Don't need it. Yeah, there we go, it's gone. Okay, next thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna come up here and I'm just gonna select all of column C. Now what I'm about to show you, you can do with any, you can do with a single cell. You can do it with groups of cells of various sizes. It doesn't have to be a whole column or a whole row or anything like that. You could do it with a range of cells. You could do it with just one cell, perfectly fine. But in this case, I'm just going to select, column C because that just makes the most sense. Then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to click on the Data tab up at the top. When I do that, I get the data commands down here in the ribbon in this little area up at the top. And over here, I'm going to find this section called Data Tools. We're going to use this quite a bit today. So we do want to be familiar with this. Now, depending on the version of Excel you're using, and depending on how your screen is set up, you might see a small data validation button like I do right here, or you might have sort of a bigger one that looks, let's see if I can show you. Now let's just leave it. Excel's probably, or Zoom is probably going to freak out. Anyway, it'll look exactly like this little icon does. It's got a check mark and a little like Ghostbusters thing that you can, but it's bigger and it'll say data validation under it if you get the bigger version of the button. Regardless, in this case, I have the small one. I'm going to click on the icon. Now I could click on this little drop-down arrow here and then click data validation in the menu. That's perfectly fine. Either way will get you to the same place. the place that we want to be is this data validation dialog box. So in the dialog box, you have a bunch of different options, which we'll talk about in a second here. But the one I'm going to start with is here it says allow. Rather than choose any value in the dropdown, I'm going to switch it to list. Ignore blank and in cell dropdown, I want to leave checked. Excuse me. And now what I'm going to do is select the source, where the information is coming from that I'm validating against. We'll kind of set this up and then I'll tell you kind of more in depth how it's working. I'll click this little arrow, up arrow next to the source box right here. When I do that, it kind of rolls my data validation dialog box up like a window shade here. And now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select just the 3 cells that say business, consumer, and government, my 3 customer types. I'll hold down with the mouse and just drag until I have all 3 selected. And you'll notice it fills in the addresses of those cells right here. So I've got $M, $2, $M, $4. So that's the range M2 to M4. But as I showed you last week, you have the dollar signs in front of the column letters or the row numbers. That gives you what we call an absolute reference, where Excel is saying, where you're saying to Excel, I don't want you to change this, even if you move it somewhere else. So in this case, we've got that set up. Now I'm just going to click the little button again over here next to the box, and it rolls it back out, and I'll click OK. All right. So now I've applied data validation to all of these cells in column C here. If I leave them alone, then nothing's going to happen. But if I want to fill in a customer type, I'll just click the little arrow right here, and I'll click on consumer, because this is a consumer account. And I get the little drop down. I can just select the option that I want and then move on. I could also type it in and press enter. That'll work. But if I type it wrong, this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell. I can click retry to try typing it again. I can click cancel to cancel it out and revert the cell back to what it was before. Or I could click help if I want to see the documentation about how data validation works. So I'll click cancel to just set it back, and I'll use the drop down because that's a lot easier. So basically now, so now that I have this, I have the option to either use the drop-down box or type in the value that I want in the cell. The option that I don't have is to put in something that's not in the list of options that I told Excel were acceptable in this column. So if I said city, that's just flat out wrong. It doesn't work. So I'll have to go, oh yeah, right, I said government, didn't I? Okay, cool. So that can help you avoid errors in data entry, which, boy, is that handy a lot of times. And it can just make it easier on you. Rather than type GOVERMENT, you just 2 clicks and you're there. Super easy. And I can do a similar thing over here with a category if I want to. So I could go, I'll select the column, click on data validation, allow rather than any value list, ignore blank. So that one's going to, if you have a blank cell, it won't check it against data validation, which is good because if you have a blank cell, usually that means you haven't filled it in yet. But I guess really what ignore blank, the main thing that it's for is like, you can turn that off. And then if you try to edit the contents of a cell, data validation will say, oh, that's wrong. Because, you could do that in a situation where you want to make sure that there's a value in that cell. That can be pretty useful. Okay, and then in cell dropdown, that's the dropdown arrow. If I uncheck that, then it'll still do the data validation, but it won't give me the dropdown menu. And who doesn't want the dropdown menu? So here I'll go down next to the source blank. I'll click the little arrow, come over here and we're looking at category. So I'll select these 5 cells with purchase, repair, return, inquiry, and other. I'll click the arrow to roll this back out. Then I'll click OK. And again, I can say, okay, status or the category is a repair for this customer. Cool. So that's how you do data validation. The other options with data validation, there are a lot of other options. And in the handout, when that is available, I do at least gloss all of them. But you can, essentially, you can do any value in whole number and decimal. Those are going to require you to put a number in the cell. So if it's text, if it's something that Excel doesn't recognize as a number, then it's not going to allow it. And you can also set it up so that Excel checks it to make sure that it's above a minimum and below a maximum, or that it's equal to a certain thing or whatever. So that can be really useful. The date and time, those are exactly what they sound like. If whatever you put in the cell can't be, if Excel can't, can't identify that as a date or time value, then it'll kick it out and say, sorry, that's not allowed. And of course, again, you can set like a minimum and maximum, or an earliest and latest dates and times. The text length, that is the that's how long you can, essentially how many characters of text you can put in. So a character is just like anything, a letter, a number, a symbol, a space in your text. So if I'm only allowing 5 characters, then once I put in, I could put in, say, the word radar, but I couldn't put in, say, mass spectrometer, because that's too long. It's too many characters. And then custom, you can write a formula that essentially checks the values that you put into the cell against the formula or against something specific. That's a little weird and complicated. We're not necessarily going to dig into that. But I am going to show you something similar to that in the conditional formatting section a little bit later. And some of those skills will apply pretty directly. If I want to remove data validation, I can click, in this case, if I hit clear all, then that's going to remove data validation from this cell. If I check apply these changes to all other cells with the same settings, you'll notice it selects all of column E. And if I clicked clear all there, if I went up here and clicked any value, then it's just going to remove the data validation from that. That's the basics of data validation. It's really useful for essentially for preventing errors before they even crop up. Very, very handy. What questions do y'all have about that before we move on to the next thing? Cool. Okay, great. All right, let's move on to removing duplicates. So this is a really handy thing that I previously had to leave out of the Excel course. Some of this other stuff is too, but I previously had to leave this out of the Excel course, and I'm excited to be able to show it to you. It's honestly extremely simple, but it's very useful. So here's what we've got. In this list of 50 people, we have some duplicates. These are, like a list of customers or whatever, and we have some duplicate customers. And so what I want to do is clean up our spreadsheet here a little bit and make sure we get rid of those duplicates, so we just have one listing for each customer, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to just select all of this. So I'm going to start with A1 and I'm going to drag it down till I get to J51. If for some reason you get down here to J51 and everything's not selected, you can click on that one and then drag upwards too. That totally works. Okay, so I've got this whole thing selected. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here And again, this is in the data tab. So if you've moved out of the data tab, make sure you click that. And over here is this little button that says remove duplicates. And again, much like with the data validation, depending on your screen setup, you might see a bigger remove duplicates button rather than this tiny one. Either way, it'll work the same. When I click on that, it's going to give me the remove duplicates dialog box right here. So it says to delete duplicate values, select one or more columns that contain duplicates. There's a checkbox here that says my data has headers. I do have headers at the top here. Each column is labeled with email address, name, first name, last name, street address, etc. But if I didn't have that, then I would want to uncheck this box and it would just use the column letters instead, like so. In this case, though, I want to make sure that that's checked because otherwise it's going to mix this in, or it's going to assume that this is part of the data set, these labels. Okay, so down here at the bottom, we have a list of all of the columns in my data set here. There's the email column, the title column, first name, last name, just like we see up at the top here. And here's the trick. We have a few people who have some sort of, well, let me just show you the difference actually. I'm gonna leave all of these checkboxes checked and I'm gonna click OK. When I do that, it says 14 duplicate values found and removed, 36 unique values remain. So that seems good until I look through here a little bit more. If I look through here a little bit more, eventually I'm going to find that, oh, here we go. So this one is Mr. Freddie Birmingham. And this one up here is Mr. Frederick Birmingham. And if you look at them, you'll notice like they have the same, street address and they have the same email address. So the difference is this one's Frederick and this one's Freddie. So, you know, maybe someone re-entered it when they searched, you know, when they searched Frederick and couldn't find it, or when they searched Freddie and couldn't find it, or whatever. And so I want to be a little more intentional about this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to come back up here to remove duplicates. And this time I'm going to click this button that says unselect all. When I do that, it unchecks all of these columns. But I'm going to come down here and I'm going to check the one next to only email. And I could select multiple columns if I wanted to, but the email address for our purposes is the deciding factor. Each individual customer only has one email address associated with them. And so I can use that to safely narrow everything down. You'll just need to know for your data set, you know, where which things the mistakes might be in, like which places the mistakes might be in and stuff like that. So I've checked only email. I'm going to click OK. And now 19 duplicate values found and removed, 31 unique values remain. So now we have, I guess it's counting the header column as a unique value, or the header row, I should say. But anyway, so now we have our 30 actual customers with no duplicates. And so that's a really useful thing. Basically, the removing duplicates, all you need to do is select it, go up there, and then choose the columns that are going to be unique, or that the columns that are essentially definitely going to be duplicated among your data set. If you don't know exactly, you can just kind of fiddle around with it. Particularly, you might find, you know, and you might also sort. You know, I would recommend, I didn't do this time, but I would also kind of recommend sorting by something that's easy to spot. So like the last name, for example, and that way you can kind of visually compare and just see if there are any duplicates that were missed because of the options that you checked, things like that. So that's removing duplicates. It's pretty straightforward. It's very, very handy. And I definitely encourage you to use it. Okay, let's move on to protecting the parts of a workbook. there are several different ways that we can do this, and I want to show you. Let me show you. I'm going to click on this protecting sheet down at the bottom. And when I do, there's, I've got my, I have another data set here with, actually, I guess the same customers, the real ones. But I've added some additional information. Specifically, I've added their credit card information. These are fake credit card numbers. Don't try and use them. You won't get any free stuff from Amazon if you do. So we've got our fake credit card numbers and security codes and expiration dates here. So what we're going to do, let me show you a few different ways to sort of protect information. Sometimes you'll want to protect it from, from being deliberately messed up or, tampered with in some way. In some situations, you just want to prevent accidental edits that are going to cause problems because goodness knows we're all capable of like selecting the wrong cell and hitting delete and not realizing it, or things like that you definitely want to make sure you safeguard against, particularly if it's very important information that you're dealing with. So the first thing that I want to show you is a couple of ways to just sort of hide information. And it's not going to be hidden in a particularly flashy way. It's just going to be hidden in, it's just going to be kind of put out of your way so that it's harder to make accidental edits to, and anything that's sort of distracting or extraneous can be, you can kind of ignore it. So for instance, if I didn't need all of this location information like the street address, city, state, and zip, I could hide those away. So let's do that. I'm going to choose, I can click on, or I don't even need to click on it. I can right click on the column letter I here, and I can click hide. So I'm clicking with the right mouse button, and then I'm clicking hide in the menu that pops up. If I want to do multiple, so if I want to say I want to hide all these J through M, I'll hold down on the column letter, and then I'll drag over until I get columns J through M selected. I'll right click with the mouse anywhere in this green area basically, and I'll click hide. When I do that, you'll notice I now have a G, and then there's kind of a weird gap right here, and then N. And of course, G and N don't go together. So I know right away, like, oh, there's something happening here. There are some columns that have been hidden, as long as I know what to look for. If I go up here to the top, you'll notice if I move my mouse right in that gap, it turns into two black lines with two black arrows pointing left and right. If I right click in that spot, then you'll notice it says unhide. When I click on that, I get a column back, click on it again, whoops. And I can keep going like that until I get all my columns back. And then there's another little hidden one just for us to find the secret column right here. So now I've got, now I have all my columns visible. I also have, if you notice, if you try to scroll, I also have a row hidden, and rows are hidden the same way. If I right click right here above row 2, the 2 row number, and click unhide, there's a secret top row. So that's how you hide. That's how you hide and unhide columns and rows in your sheets. It's pretty straightforward. Nothing too crazy about it. You can also hide and unhide entire sheets. So let's say that I want to do that. I'll right click on the protecting sheet and I'll click hide. And now it's disappeared for me. I can no longer see it. But if I go over here and I right click on the name of any of the sheets, I'll click unhide. And now there's the protecting sheet. I'll click OK. And now it's back. There's also another hidden sheet called hidden sheet. And when I unhide that one, then I get some fireworks. So that's the most basic way. Now that's not going to stop anyone who's determined to make unauthorized changes to your workbook, but it is probably going to stop you from making changes that you don't want to make in your spreadsheets, and that's definitely something that can be extremely useful. So let's see. There's also, let me go ahead. I'm actually going to delete this row right here, row 1. So I'm going to right click on the row number for 1 and click delete. And that's just going to delete that row so that it's not in our way, causing problems and confusion. Okay, so now we have our data here. And the next thing that I want to try is I want to protect individual cells or groups of cells, I guess, from being changed. Specifically, I want to protect these 3 pieces of card information, so that way I can, that can't be inadvertently changed or stolen or whatever. To do that, it's kind of weird, but what I'm actually going to have to do first is, or what I'm going to do is protect the sheet first. So let's talk about that. If you wanted to have a sheet, if you wanted to have an entire sheet that was just for reference where it couldn't be changed, then you want to protect that entire sheet from any changes. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to click on the Review tab up at the top. And I'm going to find this button that says Protect Sheet. When I click on that, then I get this Protect Sheet dialog box. And I'm going to say, I'll make the password just, protect. And there's a checkbox here that says Protect Worksheet and Contents of Locked Cells. So what this is going to do, if you come down here a little bit, you'll notice we have some additional sort of permissions that you can give people without them having to unlock it. So for example, even if the sheet is still locked, we have the ability to select pretty much any, or even if the sheet is protected, we can still have pretty much any, we can still see any of the cells and select them. That's perfectly fine. We can also, but there's a lot of other things that we could potentially do that we're not going to be able to do because those are unchecked. You can tweak these settings for whatever your purposes are, but I'm just going to click OK. And again, it's asking me to confirm what the password is, so that way I don't, I make sure that I haven't just typed in something that I haven't had a typo in entering the password or anything. I'll click OK. All right, so now if I try to, I can click around, I can select any of these cells that I want, but if I try to change something, hang on. Okay, I've got my settings wrong here. All right. How strange. Oh, okay. Yeah, I really did. Okay. Yeah, I did have my settings wrong on this. I apologize. So what I ended up doing, I had already done this previously in setting up the spreadsheet, and I made a mistake there. So what should happen when I do that by default on a normal sheet that's where the settings are all correct is I should be able, or is any cell that I click in, if I go to try and change it, it'll say the cell or chart you're trying to change is on a protected sheet. To make a change, unprotect the sheet. You might be requested to enter a password. So I come up here, click unprotect sheet, and then I have to type in my password and press enter. And now it's been unlocked. So now I could make changes, change that to an 8 or whatever. But here's what happened, but I actually kind of, because of the way that, let me reset this and I'll show you what it's supposed to be. So normally what's going to happen is when you right click on a cell or a group of cells, you can click Format Cells. And then there are all these tabs up here. Of course, there's the number format like we talked about in part 1, text alignment, the font, the border of the cell, the fill color. And then there's a protection tab here. There's a check mark that says locked and a check mark that says hidden. And the check mark that says locked by default is checked on all the cells in your entire sheet. That check mark that says locked is normally checked unless you change it. But as it says, locking cells or hiding formulas has no effect until you protect the worksheet. So, so I'll just leave this as it was. If I want to protect a specific group of cells, but not all of the cells, what I'm going to do is actually select the cells where I want people to be able to make changes and modify them. So I'm going to come over here. I want people to be able to change the name and the email address. I want them to be able to change all this information over here, but I don't want them to be able to change the credit card information. So I'm going to select these columns first, right click on the cells, click with that right mouse button and click Format Cells. And I'm going to uncheck the locked checkbox. I'll click OK. Then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select these columns with the other data in them that are on the other side of this the credit card info. I'll right click again, Format Cells, go to the Protection tab and uncheck Locked again and click OK. So having done that, these cells, if you look at them, they still say locked right here. But any of these cells, whether it's this one or one of the ones with the name or the email address or whatever, one of these over here, I can change any of those that I want to right now because the sheet is not protected at this point. So if I come back up here and click Protect Sheet and give it a password. Cool. Now, if I try to change these, because I unchecked that locked setting, I can change those if I want to. But for this, since I didn't uncheck the locked setting on these cells in columns E, F, and G, then I get an error if I try to change those. So that's how you protect only some cells from being edited. Turn off or select the cells that you want to be editable once you've locked the sheet. Right click on those cells, go to the Protect tab and click on, oops, go to the Protect or go to the Protection tab and click on or uncheck Locked. And then once you've got all those cells unlocked, protect the sheet, and then any cells that are any cells that do still have that locked setting on will be unchangeable. So that's it. And of course, don't forget what the password is because otherwise you won't be able to change it either. Okay, so now we have the big one. We can protect an entire workbook if we want to. What I'm going to do is come up here and click on Protect Workbook. I have it's asking me for a password, and there's two different checkboxes here. Now, there's a checkbox that says Windows that's grayed out. Basically, the idea behind this is you can lock your workbook to exactly the view that you want people to use. But apparently in some versions of Excel, including the newest versions of Excel, that option is not available. So I don't know why that checkbox is still there, but just grayed out. But that's how it is for some reason. So, But protect workbook for structure right here stops you from doing a number of things. Including but not limited to renaming a sheet. Workbook is protected and cannot be changed. Deleting a sheet, that's grayed out. Renaming it, moving it. I can't move the sheet in relation to other ones. There are a few other things, but you can still change some of the data inside the sheet. So, I could change something there. Some of the data can still be changed. So if there's specific data you do not want to be changed, in addition to just things like adding or deleting sheets and things like that. Oh yeah, you can't unhide a sheet either or add one. So if you come down here, you'll notice unhide and hide are not options. So you can't hide or unhide sheets either. Lots of those things are locked down once you've protected the workbook. If I click here again, and I put my password back in, now it's unprotected, and I can come down here and add a sheet or whatever I want to do. I'll undo that. Whoops. Yeah, undo doesn't work for that. Delete, thank you. Okay. All right, excellent. So those are different ways that you can lock down your workbook to protect it. Let's move on quickly to conditional formatting. It looks like we're maybe a smidge behind schedule, so I want to make sure that that we get to the stuff that I want to show you. When I click on the conditional formatting sheet down here, I mean, still, if you have questions, please ask them. But I'm gonna go ahead and move forward, and then if I get a question, I'll pause and address it. Okay, cool. So I'm going to click on I've clicked on the conditional formatting sheet down here. Conditional formatting is a really versatile command or option that you have in Excel that that helps you kind of see specific types of information at a glance. It's the color coding in the title of the class today: color coding, logic, and more. So in this particular example sheet, what I have is the data from over in my data validation sheet, this time filled in, and the data validation's turned on. And actually the list of data validation stuff is over on another sheet, the hidden reference sheet. So that way we can get it out of the way. What I want to do now is I want to figure out some ways that I can highlight certain parts of this sheet so that I can quickly, kind of at a glance, tell what the most important stuff is, what the stuff is that I need to deal with and prioritize. And I can use conditional formatting in a number of different ways to make that happen. I'm going to click on the Home tab here to start out, and there's a conditional formatting button right here on the Home tab. It is a drop-down, so if I click on that, it gives me this drop-down menu. And there are a lot of different options for conditional formatting. Not all of them we're going to get into, but I'm going to show you some really fun examples here. Okay, so first things first, we can color code or apply conditional formatting based on a scale. So let's say, well, let's look at this priority column here. So column I, we have priority, and then we have all of these numbers down here for various priority levels, from 1 being the, we'll say the lowest priority, to 10 being, say, the highest priority. I'm going to select this entire column, and I'm going to come up here to conditional formatting. And I'm going to look for color scales here. That's a nice way to do this. And I've got, there's a green, yellow, red. I'm actually going to go with the red, yellow, green. So essentially, the highest priority will be, the highest numbers will be red. the lowest numbers will be 1. When I click on this, what it's doing is it's looking at all the cells that have values in this column. And it's saying, okay, so there's some high values here and there's some low values here. And essentially like this, the cells where they're sort of, that are sort of in the middle value-wise are yellow. So you'll notice the 5s and particularly the 5s and 6s are mostly yellow. If it's lower than that, kind of a low priority, then the 1s and 2s and stuff, those are green. And it gets lighter green, more towards yellow as we move up the scale. Once we pass through yellow, then we get to red. And so like the not the absolute highest priority, but like the 7s and 8s are orange. And then the 9s and 10s are red. And so I can look at this at a glance and say, okay, there's a 10 here, there's a 9 here, there's a 9, 10, 9, 10, 10. Okay, those are my most important ones, you know, the highest priority level. So maybe I need to focus on those. And of course, I can also sort it based on that. If I go over here, sort and filter and click filter, I could go, sort largest to smallest. And then because of the way I told Excel to calculate these dates, it is going to kind of flip them, or it is going to change this, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Anyway, or it is going to give you a little error message, but don't worry about that, is what I'm saying. Okay, so I could do that. I'll go ahead and shuffle that back to where it was. Good, good. So that's one option. You can color code on a scale and it'll basically look at all the values in relation to each other and figure out which ones are the highest and which ones are the lowest and color code them that way. That can be pretty handy. You can also do it based on a specific reference. So this is the number of days open. And over here, I have a little reminder for myself, close cases within 5 days. So what I want to do is have, I want to make sure that any of these where the number is, or where it hasn't been, or where it's been open for too long, I want to make sure that that's highlighted for me. So again, I'm going to select my column here. And I'm going to come over and do highlight cells rules here. So I want to, in order to make this work properly, I could do one rule basically, or to do it the basic way. And I could add several more if I wanted to. I'll go ahead and just show you the one for right now. So I'm going to say greater than, format cells that are greater than. So in this case, it guessed 4, and it's highlighting in red the cells that have a value greater than 4. For some reason, it's doing that with this cell too. Not sure why that is. It's a little weird when it comes to like text in comparison with colors, but, or I mean with numbers, but whatever, we can deal with that. What I'm actually going to do though is change this rather than using just a static number where then I would have to go in and change my conditional formatting rule later on. If let's say that the guidelines change and I need to close cases within within 4 days, like I could change this to 5, which is what it needs to be right now. But if the guidelines change and I only get 4 days, or if they change and I get 6 days, then rather than going in and changing the conditional formatting rules, I want to be able to just change this cell to a different number. That'd be pretty handy because then I don't have to worry about fooling with these rules anymore. So what I'm going to do is point the conditional formatting to this cell with the 5 in it. To do that, I can click the little thing to roll it up again. Click here. And it fills in the absolute reference to this cell, $K, $2, because that's cell K2. I'll roll it back down, click OK. And now anything that's over 5 days old is going to be highlighted in red for me. So it's like, oh, you're overdue on these. And that'll do the trick. Now, in order to get this to look the way I want it to, I don't want it to be like that. So I'll come over here and I'll do clear, or I'll click on conditional formatting, click clear rules, or go to clear rules and click clear rules from selected cells. So that's going to leave the formatting on all these other cells, but it'll remove it from just H1, which is what I want. All right, so that's another way to do it. You can base it on a reference like that. And of course, oh yeah, of course, if I change this, probably should test it out, change it to 4, then suddenly the ones that are 5 and over get highlighted. If I change it to 6, then I have a lot less red there. Okay, so option number 3 here is to color code my, and actually I want to do my entire rows here based on the type. So the customer type over here. My customer type, remember I had the 3 types: consumer, government, and business. And I want to color code those each separately so I can kind of see at a glance which types of cases I have right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to select all of these columns right here because I'm going to color code all these columns based on what's in column C here. Then I'm going to come up, click on the conditional formatting button, and I'm going to find, let's see, where is it? I'm going to find my, or I'm going to come down here and click on manage rules. And that's going to give me a little dialog box, the conditional formatting rules manager. And I want to set up a new conditional formatting rule here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click new rule. And I'm going to say, so I have a bunch of different options here. Format all cells based on their values. You can read all of that. I'm not going to dig into all of this stuff. But this is essentially, rather than using the pre-made options, we're going to write, we're going to come down here and use a formula to determine which cells to format. So we're going to write a little formula that will tell Excel, okay, if it's like this, do this. Okay, so format. All right, so the first thing I want to do is color code the consumer rows, because I'm going to need a rule for each type of customer, unfortunately. So it's this format values where this formula is true. So I'm going to do an equal sign because we're writing a formula. And then I'm going to say C1. Now we're starting with C1 because I'm looking at this entire column with C. I only have to write this formula once for the top row that I'm dealing with. And then because I have the entire column selected, it will work the same way for each of the subsequent rows. Okay, so C1, but I do need to make the C absolute. So on each of these rows, so I'll put a $ in front of the C. On each of these rows, it's specifically looking at C rather than trying to figure out, rather than looking at each individual cell. So I'm saying specifically look in column C on this row by adding a $ in front of the C. So C1, oh yeah, I need to say if, excuse me, open the parentheses, $C1, so equal sign if, open the parentheses, $C1. So we're doing one of these logical functions just like we did before. C1 is equal to consumer. Whoops, I need that in quotation marks. Now, when you make an adjustment to these, be wary. If you touch those arrow keys, then it's going to start trying to select different groups of cells, and it's going to be a real hassle. So to move your little cursor around to make changes, you have to click in the box rather than using the arrow keys, which is a pain. Okay, so C1 is equal to consumer in quotation marks. That's our logical test. Our value, if true, is going to be just true. So I'm going to just type the word true in capitals and nothing else. Then our value of false, so I'll put a comma, is going to be, hey, false. And then I'll close my parentheses here. So, so equal sign if, and then in parentheses, $ C1 is equal to consumer, in quotation marks, comma, true, comma, false, and then an end parentheses here. So that's my formula. I'm going to go ahead and copy it because I'm going to use essentially the same formula in the other places here. So I've selected that. I'm going to click copy, and then I'm going to click format down here so that I can choose what it's going to look like. So we'll say for our consumer customers, we're going to we'll make them say yellow fill color here. So I'll just click fill tab up at the top, click on the yellow, on a nice yellow here, and then click OK. When I click OK again, it creates it. And if I click apply, then I can see, oh, it's working. Okay, all of my consumer lines are now in yellow. Okay, so I've done that, but I need to also color code the other two. So I'm going to come back up here and click new rule. Use a formula to determine which cells to format. I'm going to click in this little box, and I'm just going to right click and paste that in. But instead of consumer, I need to change this to inside of the quotation marks, government. So it's the same formula except government instead of consumer. When I come over here, I'll click format, and I'll make the government one say light blue. Click OK, click OK here. And now when I apply, you'll notice government highlighted in blue. So now all we have is the business customers. So I'm going to do the same thing one more time. I'll click new rule, use a formula to determine which cells. I'll click here in the blank, paste in the formula, and change consumer to government. Format, and we'll make that one, whoops, not government. That one should have been business, sorry. Business. Go down to format, make that one green, click OK there. And now when I hit apply, the business ones are highlighted in green. When I click OK, that goes away. And now each line is color coded. And if I were to change one of these, then it changes the color coding. Super easy. So all it's doing is, so for each line, let's look at these rules again. For each line, you've got if, so for this line, it's if C1 equals business, then it's true. In other words, this rule is, the criteria for this rule is met. Otherwise, it's false. So if I get a true result from this formula, then we come back over and it says, what it says is make the background of the cell the fill color green. And that applies to all of columns A through G. If I come, and then on the next row, it does the same thing. It uses C1 as kind of a stand-in. So when I get to row 2, it's actually looking at cell C2. And when I get to row 3, it's actually looking at cell C3, etc. The little $sign here to make this absolute is key, because what that's going to do is it's going to say specifically, basically, if I didn't have the $sign there, what would happen is each cell would look at itself to see whether it said business, government, or consumer. In this case, we're looking at the row, or we're looking specifically at column C on this row. So that is really handy. That allows you to quickly color code things based on selection, and it works really nicely in tandem with that data validation. We are really running low on time, so I am going to skip the other example, but I will. I'll go ahead and make a quick video of that later on that you guys will have access to, and I'll probably tack it on to the end of the video on YouTube. Okay, so let's go to the final topic here, which is tables. Tables are a really useful way that you can keep data sort of in its own little little box. And that's helpful for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll also be talking about next week. But let me show you this little example. Okay, so on this sheet, I have a list of Marvel Cinematic Universe movies and Star Wars movies. They're listed out. They do have headers over them, title, release date, director, writer. And if I were to just use my regular old sort and filter, so I'll select any of the cells in the data set, click on sort and filter, and click filter, then it adds these little drop-down arrows at the top. And if I say sort by title, so I'll click sort A to Z. Oh, it actually did it a smart way. That's nice. But, okay, so that's actually good. Looks like they've improved this functionality a little bit, thankfully. Normally if I didn't have this little row there, let's delete that. Now if I do it, then watch what's going to happen. Okay, now we have all our things mixed in together. So our two data sets have been combined when we didn't need them to be, and that can be a problem. So what I want to do is I want to keep these separate in such a way that that they're still in the same spot. So they're still here. There's no like extra row placeholder between them. But I need to keep these two sets of data separate. So I hit undo up here at the top, by the way. You can also press Control Z on your keyboard. And what I'm going to do is make each of these two a table. So I'm first going to select these on the top, all the way down to row 24. And I'm going to click on Insert Table. It says, where's the data for your table? And so it's confirming which cells they're in, A1 to D24, that's correct. And I'll leave the checkbox checked that says my table has headers and click OK. Oops, okay, it's giving me an error message about the filters. Let me go ahead and remove those. So I'm going back here, click on sort and filter and click filter again. Okay, now we'll come back. I'll click insert, click table. And there we go. My table has headers, click OK. And now I get this nice little setup right here. So I have my header row at the top. I have all my data down here. It can be sorted and filtered within the table. So if I click sort A to Z, it's going to sort only the things within the table. And if I scroll down, you'll notice it also replaces the column letters with the names of the columns in my table. So that can be really nice too, because if I forget by the time I get down to row 200 or whatever, which column is which, I can just glance up and see it. That makes it really easy. And now I'm going to come down here, select these, click insert and table again. I'll go ahead and change the color so that they're visually distinct from each other. So now I can sort and filter these separately without any worry about them getting mixed up together. I have this nice little zebra stripe, what they call banded rows effect, so that I can easily glance across and keep visually on the same row. I can add some additional kinds of data analysis, including summarize with pivot table, which we'll talk about next week. And I can remove duplicates inside the table very easily. And I can even rename the table. So if I wanted to call this one Marvel, I'll just click there and press enter. And then if I come down here, Star Wars, press enter. So now I can refer to these tables by name, just like when we named a range of cells last week. So I can use it very easily inside of a formula. For bonus points, I'll go ahead and this is the last thing I'm going to show you except for whatever questions y'all have. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the table by clicking convert to range while I have a cell inside the table selected. And again, up here, so there's a table design tab that pops up when you have a cell inside a table selected. I'm going to click convert to range. And then what I can do if I want, or another thing that I can do that could help here is I can actually, if I don't want to make it a full-on table, I can actually make these header rows and or these header column, or excuse me, the header row and the column, or in the row labels over here, the names of the movies in this case, I could make those travel along with me as I scroll through the sheet. To do that, what I'm going to do is come up here to the top and click on the View tab. And then I'm going to select this cell, in this case, cell B2 right here. I'm going to come up to the top in the View tab and click on Freeze Panes and click Freeze Panes. You'll notice I get kind of a thicker line here. And when I scroll down, that first row goes along with me. And when I scroll over, that first column goes along with me. And the way that this works is you select essentially the first cell that you want to roll off as you scroll. So in this case, I've selected a cell below column or row 1, which I want to scroll with me, and a cell to the right of column A, which I want to scroll with me. And so, and once I had that cell selected, I clicked Freeze Panes. Now I can unfreeze if I want to, and that'll work. I also have the option for Freeze Top Row, which will just do the top row regardless of what cell you have selected, or Freeze First Column, which will do the first column regardless of what you have selected. All right, that's pretty much it. What questions do y'all have before we wrap it up for today? Hey everybody, as promised, here's that last example about conditional formatting that we didn't have time to get to during the class session. I'll go ahead and dive right in. If you're using the example file, this is on the Conditional Formatting 2 sheet down here at the bottom. So let's get started. First thing that we want to do is we want to select the cells that we want to highlight. In this example, what we're going to try to do is we're going to use this sales data that we used back on in our charts, and we're going to essentially color code each quarter for each salesperson according to whether they did better in the previous quarter or worse in the previous quarter in terms of their sales numbers. So in order to do that, we're going to first select the cells that we want to color code. Now, since the data in column B is sort of the first data that we're working with, there's no previous data for us to look back on, at least on this sheet. We're going to leave column B alone, and instead we're going to start with column C. So I'll come up here and I'll select all of columns C through I. All right, now that I've done that, what I'm going to do is come back up to the top, and I'm going to find the Conditional Formatting button on the Home tab up here. Click on that, and then we'll come on down to Manage Rules. When I do that, it's going to give me this list of rules that's empty right now, but we're going to fill that in. And basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be writing this formula as though we're only applying it to the top left cell of our selection. So in this case, that's going to be cell C1. That's the one that we're working with, basically, when we write our formulas. But then what happens is, because all of these cells are selected, it's going to work the exact same way as if we copied a formula from cell to cell like we did last week in part 2. And so it's going to change those references. So when we say C1 in this formula, when that same conditional formatting is applied to, say, cell D3, then it's going to look around it in the same places that cell C1 looked. And we'll kind of circle back to that. Okay, so let's write a version of the formula. We're going to put basically the same formula several times with slight tweaks. I'll show you what I mean. I'll click on New Rule. I'm going to go to Use a Formula to determine which cells to format. I'm going to hit =, to tell Excel to expect a formula. I'm going to type the word if, open a set of parentheses, and then just a reminder, the three arguments that we need, the three pieces of information for the if function to work are going to be the logical test. So basically a statement that's either true or false. And then after a comma, the value of true. And then after a comma, the value of false. Another way to say those is what to do if the statement's true versus what to do if the statement's false. So our logical test is going to be, in this case, C1, which stands in for whichever cell we're working with, is less than B1. So C1 is less than B1. So what that's going to do is tell cell C1, okay, look over here at cell B1, see which value is greater. If the value of C1 is less, then this formula is going to turn out to be true. If it's not, then this formula is going to turn out to be false. So, excuse me. So we've got that written out. I'm going to put a comma. That'll tell it, okay, this is the next argument. The next argument is our value if true. And lo and behold, that value is going to be true. This is some technical stuff, so if you want to tune out for a few seconds, that's perfectly fine. But what I'm putting in here by putting the word true in there outside of quotation marks is what in computer world we call a Boolean value. So it's basically, it's not just the word true. Your computer basically thinks of true in this sort of sense as being the sort of absolute value of truth in a way. Like, that's not a great explanation, but essentially this is the value true rather than just the word true. And that means something special to your computer in this particular situation. We're going to do the same thing after this. I'm going to put a comma and type the word false, F-A-L-S-E, and I'll close my parentheses. And there we have it. So this is our formula. It's going to check to see whether C1 is less than B1. If it is, then we bring back the value true. That's the answer to this whole formula. If not, then we get the answer false, and that's the value of this whole formula. So if it turns out to be true, then what do we need to do? Well, we're going to come down here, click on Format, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the Fill tab up here at the top. If you don't see these little color swatches, then you're on one of the other tabs. So click Fill up here, and then I'll click on the red. That's a little bright. So let's come down here. I'll click on More Colors, click Custom up here at the top, and I'll slide this little slider up until I get something that's kind of between red and pink. I'll click OK and OK one more time, and that'll be good. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this formula right here, and I'm going to go ahead and copy it so that I can paste it easily into my into the other boxes and just tweak it where I need it tweaked. So all that's done, I'll click OK, and now I've got the first rule. Let's add another rule. I'm going to click New Rule again. Use a formula to determine which cells to format. I'm going to come down here, click in this box, and I'm just going to paste it in. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut this time, which again is Control-V. That works in almost any program in all of Windows. Control-V to paste. And this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to be kind of a gray if the number hasn't changed at all from one salesperson to another, or from one quarter to another, excuse me. So I'll click here, and I'll erase my less than sign and put an equal sign there instead. We'll go down to Format, and I'll make it kind of that's a light gray. That's nice. So I'll click OK. And now, if the two values are equal, if the cell that I'm looking at, which in this formula is C1, but it could be, the cell F4 just as easily. Let's say F4 is equal to E4, then it's going to give me true, and it'll turn the cell gray. If not, then it's going to give me false and it won't do anything to the cell. So I'll click OK. All right, and that one shows up on top of the other. Of course, there's another scenario here, and that is of course, if the starting number is greater than, or excuse me, the starting number is less than the new number. So I'll go new rule again, use a formula to determine which cells to format, paste it in, Control V, and then I'll change this less than sign to a greater than sign. So you hold Shift while pressing the period key. I'll click Format, and I'll turn it to a nice light green. Click OK, and OK. So now we have our 3 rules. There's one other rule, though, that we need to apply, which is if it's not a number in here, we don't want it to be formatted at all. So I'm going to come up here, click New Rule one more time, and I will come down, use a formula to determine which cells to format, click in there, hit the equal sign, add in an if, open a set of parentheses, and then we're going to use one additional little function, which I had to look up when I was coming up with this example. It's quite useful. So the function is number. So with the isNumber function, I'll type isNumber, all one word, and then add a left parenthesis after that. And I'm going to put C1, so referring more generally to the cell that the formatting is going to work on. So it's checking to see whether each cell here has a number in it, just a plain number. Of course, there are numbers, there are numerals up here at the top in these column headings, but year 1 Q4 is no one's idea of a number taken as a whole. And so Excel is going to check to see whether it's a numerical value in the cell or whether it's text or something else. And so it should find that it's not text. So what we're going to do, that's our logical test. Basically, the isNumber function will come back and say true or false. Confusingly, what we're going to do next is we're going to add a comma, and our value, if true, is going to be false. And I'll go ahead and comma again. Our value, if false, is going to be true. So what happens is, essentially, this formula goes, is whatever's in C1, or whichever cell we're looking at, a number? If it is a number, then it gives the if a true, but then the if goes, okay, well, we need to look at the value if true then. But the value of true is going to be false, because what we want it to do is, if there's a number in the cell that we're looking at, we want it to go, oh, I don't need to color code that. So we'll return false, and that'll be the value of the whole formula. If it is a number, or excuse me, if it's not a number, then we'll use the value of false, which is true. So so it'll come back, it'll say true, and we can, it'll say, oh, okay, maybe I do need to format. But we're actually also going to leave this blank, because what we want it to do is leave the cell unchanged if there's not a number, a numerical value in there. I'll click OK. That'll create this. Then we need to do one more thing, one final touch. Over here, I'll say stop if true. So if it turns out this formula is true, then it's going to stop, and it won't look at any of these other rules to figure out whether it needs to format any further. So that way it doesn't get confused, since there are numerals in there. This will help. All right, so we've done all that, and I'll go ahead and click apply and make sure it's working. Sure enough, there it is. So if you look over here, anytime that the value is lower than the amount that's in the cell to the left of it, it's going to turn red. Anytime that the value is higher than the cell to the left of it, it's going to be green. If they were equal, which there aren't any equal ones in this set of data, but if it was, it would turn gray. And then up here at the top, all of those are not formatted in any way. Whoops, I'll go ahead and hit OK. And you can see It worked. That's the example. If you're watching this in the next couple of days, then, well, if you're watching it in the next little while, then happy Thanksgiving. If you're watching this sometime in the future, then, and if you're watching it during Thanksgiving season, stay safe, wash your hands, etc., wear a mask, and hopefully I will see most everyone next week for part 4. Bye.